Nice to meet you all. I'm Arai Shoji from Class 2B. Well then, let me share with you today's second story. How do you all feel about the old school building? It's scary, isn't it? How about you, Kurata-san? It's scary. It is, isn't it? Just by looking at it, you never know when it might fall apart. Even from a distance, you can tell how dangerous it is. That old school building that's now off limits. Several years have passed since it fell out of use, and after that, all they did was patrol it at night. For sure, I heard that it took place about 10 years ago now. Of course, they don't do it anymore. Night patrols are, of course, important. It's not just thieves who enter during the night, but potentially outsiders who try to sleep in the school as well. But not like there was much there to steal in the first place. So then, why did the night patrols eventually stop? There's a good reason for that. Let me tell you why. There was once a teacher by the name of Sakurai, although I doubt any of you know him. He's not here anymore, after all. Apparently, he was a very good teacher. He was dedicated and smart, and put his entire heart into whatever he did. The teachers at the time hated night patrols of the old building. Whoever was on duty for the day always complained and refused to patrol the building. Or, if they did, they'd simply shine a light from outside and then leave again. And even if they did think about going inside, casting a light on the old, rotting wood was enough to make them run back. So, on the surface, the patrols were taking place, but the reality was somewhat different. Even the teachers ran from the building, so it was unlikely that anybody else would be hiding inside. That's what they told themselves, and how they justified not going inside. But there was just one teacher who did carry out his night duty correctly. That was Mr. Sakurai. It wasn't like he wasn't scared. If one had to pick, he was probably even more scared than the others. But he also had a stronger sense of responsibility as well. He couldn't just cut corners like the other teachers. There were even those who laughed in the shadows at the earnest Mr. Sakurai going about his night patrols in the old school building. Being the teacher on duty wasn't exactly a rare occurrence, but whenever it approached, Mr. Sakurai found himself feeling down. Then, it was his turn again. On this particular day, it was hot and humid as a midsummer's day, even though it was September. Humidity has a way of making people irrationally angry. Sweat from all over soaks into your shirt, making it cling to your skin. This greatly increases your annoyance towards things. It was that type of day. As night fell, the temperature showed no signs of dropping, and the heat continued. A cool breeze might have helped dampen the irritation, but the only wind that blew was wrapped in humid heat. As the heat continued unabated, the time for his night patrol arrived. The old school building was always the last place on the list to visit. First, the new school and the gym, the pool, etc. And then finally, he had to take on the old school. It was so humid on this particular day that his patrol proceeded without anything of note. He finished his inspection of the pool without problem, and all that was left was the old school building. For some reason, Mr. Sakurai suddenly got chills down his spine. He laughed, thinking that perhaps the overbearing humidity had, on the contrary, made him cold. But still, he couldn't rid himself of that horrible feeling. Something didn't feel right. Perhaps he shouldn't go through with the patrol of the old building this time. What should he do? His patrol. Mr. Sakurai was troubled. But still, he couldn't neglect his patrol. If, by chance, an accident were to occur, then the responsibility would lie fully with him. With that line of thinking, he found his feet carrying him towards the building. The old school building no longer had electricity. As such, he grew even more scared, and all he could rely on was the single torchlight at his feet. For some reason, that light felt weaker than usual. Perhaps the batteries were almost empty. Mr. Sakurai hurried, hoping to finish his patrol much quicker than usual. It was hot, and yet he couldn't stop shaking. He always entered each classroom and carefully checked over everything, but on this day, he simply shone his torch from the door, finishing up quickly. When he was mostly done with the 3-story building, he rushed back to the night duty room. The night duty room was shut tightly, so it was like stepping into a sauna. Damn, I should have left the window open or something. Marking the day's tests, Mr. Sakurai absent-mindedly pondered the old school building. What was he so scared of? It was the same as always. Nothing had changed. And there wasn't anyone in their right mind who would try to break into it. In the end, he only patrolled the building just in case anyway. He finished marking the tests and stared out the window when he saw a faint light mixed in with the darkness. That was the direction of the old school. Could there actually be a light on in the building? Mr. Sakurai frowned. There was no way. There was no electricity in the old school. And yet, there was a light leaking from the building, so that had to mean that somebody was inside it. Somebody had snuck in without permission. He reached out for the torch beside him and quickly stood up. But just as he put his sandals on to leave the room, he realized something. If it were a thief, then... No. What if a vicious criminal had escaped from prison and was hiding out in the building? Then... It was only human of him to worry about such absurd things. But it was so unbelievable that he worried about what might happen if it proved to be real. Mr. Sakurai was at a loss for what to do. Would he be okay going over there alone? Or perhaps he would be better off staying where he was. Stay where he is and watch. For now, I'll stay here and keep an eye out. Mr. Sakurai watched from the window and didn't move a muscle. Standing so still, sweat soon drenched his face. Then it dripped from his chin. But standing there like that all night would only lead him to imagining the worst. Mr. Sakurai was a worrywart, and he couldn't stop thinking about what was over there. I'm on night duty, so I'll set a bad example if I don't do it properly. With that on his mind, Mr. Sakurai rushed over to the old school building. Perhaps something else was shining inside. Or maybe he was seeing things. Numerous thoughts ran through his mind as he quickly shuffled over. One corner of the second floor was wrapped in dim light. Somebody's here, Mr. Sakurai muttered without thinking, and gripping his torch, ran into the building. Relying on the unreliable light, he went up the squeaky stairs, careful not to lose his footing. When he reached the top and looked around, he couldn't believe his eyes. The light he'd just seen had vanished. He'd definitely seen the light about 2 classrooms down from the stairs he had just climbed. Mr. Sakurai held his breath. Perhaps the intruder realized he was there and quickly extinguished the light. If so, then he had to act very carefully. He didn't know who his opponent might be. If this person suddenly attacked him from the shadows, then he stood no chance. Mr. Sakurai turned his torch off. Darkness suddenly overwhelmed him. He didn't realize that his one single light had made so much difference. He debated over whether to turn it back on again. But he pushed the thoughts aside and suppressed his fear. There wasn't a shred of light. Not even the moonlight reached the corner. All he could do was feel his way forward in the darkness with his hands. Ah! Suddenly a sharp pain ran through his fingertip. When he touched it, it was wet. He licked it and tasted blood. He nervously extended his hand once more, and it appeared he had cut it on some broken window glass. Even though he stood in complete darkness, as time passed, his eyes grew accustomed to it. While vague, he had some idea of where he was in the old school building. Even though that didn't mean he could move around easily. There was broken glass and nails sticking out everywhere. He listened closely. If someone was nearby, he should be able to hear them make some noise. Even if this other person was also holding their breath, it was the old school building. Just the smallest movement would make the floorboards creak. He'd wait until that happened. Mr. Sakurai stood on the spot, enduring. But he couldn't hear anything. It was like nobody was there at all. Pff, some nerve this guy's got. Clucking his tongue, Mr. Sakurai was forced to make the first move. Perhaps the second floor was more rotted than the first, or perhaps it was the deathly silence, but the sounds the floor made as he moved seemed to echo even louder than usual. It sounded like the dying screams of agony of people cursing those above each time he took a step. There was no sign of movement from the intruder. Every now and then he stopped to listen, but the intruder gave no hint as to his whereabouts. Was there even anyone really there? Mr. Sakurai suddenly became anxious. Then, in order to dispel his own fear, he decided to break through the present circumstances. He couldn't bear it any longer. He turned on his torch. When he turned the torch on, a light suddenly spread out before him, and he felt at ease. But then, worry began to spread through him once more, threatening to kill that relief. This is just going to let him know where I am. But if he turned the torch off and something happened, he'd be in trouble. Just then, he sensed something behind him. Who is it? The moment he turned around, Mr. Sakurai shone the torch in the direction he expected to see a face. But nobody was there. Thinking that perhaps the person ran off instantly, he shone his torch around the area, but he couldn't see anyone. If someone had run away, he should have been able to see them, and if they moved that fast, the floorboards would have creaked as well. And yet, he couldn't sense anything. How odd. Tilting his head, Mr. Sakurai shone the torch around as he walked. Then, it happened. He heard another footstep that wasn't his own. It was right behind him. Surprised, Mr. Sakurai froze on the spot. Then, the other footsteps stopped. When did he get behind him? He wondered. Mr. Sakurai couldn't stop the hand holding the torch from shaking. But he had to check. If somebody was behind him, he had to see. Feeling a sense of duty, Mr. Sakurai swallowed the saliva that had built up in his mouth. But it was also true that he was terrified. Run without turning around. I can't face off with the intruder here. I've got to run. Mr. Sakurai ran. I should be able to see the exit once I turn that corner and run down the stairs. He was wearing sandals, so pieces of glass stabbed at his feet, but he didn't care. The building was falling apart, and shards of wood lay scattered all over, making it difficult to get a good grip on the floor. Ah! A piece of wood tripped him up, and he tumbled. Ah! He grew angry at his own misfortune. Ugh, how annoying! Mr. Sakurai shone his light to see behind him. There, he saw... Mr. Sakurai's screams echoed throughout the dark school. The next morning, they found Mr. Sakurai wandering mindlessly around the schoolyard. His torch was still on, and he reeled around as though drunk. Drool hung from his mouth, and his hair had turned pure white, and his face seemed to have aged several decades at once. Then, he's my friend, and I'm his friend. Let's all die together. Let's joyously die. He sang in a strange tone. Mr. Sakurai was admitted to the hospital. Not much seemed to help, however, and things don't look good for his recovery. They say he's still singing that tune, even now. Just what on earth did he see? He must have seen something truly terrifying. And whatever it was, it's probably still hidden in the old school, even now. If they tear the building down soon, then I wonder what'll happen to it. That's the end of my story. Thank you very much.